Hello John Salinas. Based solely on my statement, O'Keefe's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. Injuries consistent with impact and exposure, my answer would be. Based on my findings, Mr. O'Keefe's death resulted from a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. While blunt force trauma can be fatal on its own, in this case, both the trauma and the effects of hypothermia contributed to his death. Therefore, I cannot state with certainty that the blunt force trauma alone would have been fatal without the additional effects of hypothermia. Based solely on my findings, I would agree that both blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia contributed to Mr. O'Keefe's death. The injuries were consistent with significant impact, and there was also evidence of prolonged exposure to cold temperatures. In my professional opinion, the combination of these factors was necessary to cause his death. Either factor alone may not have been fatal under the circumstances, but together they resulted in his demise. Based solely on my prior statement, O'Keefe's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. Injuries consistent with impact and exposure. I cannot point to specific evidence indicating which injury occurred first. My statement reflects that both blunt force trauma and hypothermia contributed to the cause of death, but does not specify the sequence in which they occurred. Further details from the autopsy or scene investigation would be necessary to determine the order of events. Based solely on my earlier statement, O'Keefe's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. Injuries consistent with impact and exposure. My answer. The injuries I observed blunt force trauma to the head and signs of exposure are consistent with impact and hypothermia. While these injuries can result from an intentional act, it is also possible for such injuries to occur from an accidental fall, depending on the circumstances. The findings themselves do not, by themselves, distinguish between accidental and intentional causes. Yes, I would agree. My medical findings establish the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia, with injuries consistent with impact and exposure. However, determining the manner of death, whether it was accidental, homicidal, suicidal, or natural, requires additional evidence beyond the medical findings, including investigative and contextual information. As Dr. Irene Scortibello, I would answer. That is correct. Based solely on the autopsy findings, blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia, I can determine the cause of death, but I cannot determine the manner of death, whether it was a homicide, accident, suicide, or natural, without additional information from the scene, investigative findings, or witness statements. Yes, that's correct. I searched how long to die in cold because Karen asked me to. Based solely on my previous statement, Karen asked me to search for how long to die in cold after she repeatedly asked if she had hit John. Based solely on my prior statement, no, Karen did not mention any reason for wanting to know about dying in the cold that was unrelated to the incident with John. She asked me to search that at her request after the incident. As Dr. Isaac Wolf, I would answer. Yes, that is correct. The severity and pattern of head trauma can sometimes be seen in mechanisms other than a simple fall. However, based on my review of the evidence in this case, I believe that the injuries are consistent with what could occur in a fall, particularly given the circumstances described. It is important to note that while other causes are possible, a fall remains a plausible explanation for the head trauma observed. Yes, that is correct. While I testified that the head trauma could be explained by a fall, I acknowledge that similar patterns of injuries could potentially result from other mechanisms as well. My opinion is that a fall is a plausible explanation, but it is not the only possible cause. As Dr. Isaac Wolf, I would answer. That is correct. My testimony is that the head trauma could be explained by a fall, and that hypothermia was also a contributor to death. However, my testimony does not categorically rule out the possibility of non-accidental trauma as a cause of these injuries, it simply offers a plausible alternative explanation based on the findings. Yes, that's correct. I saw Ms. Reed's SUV parked near the mailbox. Based solely on my statement, I did not specify the exact duration that I observed the SUV parked near the mailbox. I only saw that it was parked there, but I cannot provide a precise length of time. Based solely on my statement, I did not mention seeing anyone inside the SUV at that time. I only observed the SUV parked near the mailbox and did not witness any collision or disturbance. That's correct. I did not witness the SUV collide with anything or cause any disturbance. I only saw it parked near the mailbox. Yes, that is true. I did hear Karen repeatedly ask if she had hit John. Yes, after Karen asked if she had hit John, she seemed very anxious and distraught. She was visibly upset and kept repeating the question. Her behavior was frantic, and she appeared desperate to understand what had happened. This concern led her to ask me to search for information about how long someone could survive in the cold. Based solely on my testimony, Karen did not explicitly state that she was responsible for what happened to John. She repeatedly asked if she hit John and asked me to search how long to die in cold, but she did not directly admit responsibility. Based solely on my prior statement, no, other than Karen repeatedly asking if she hit John, I did not hear her make any additional statements that could be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Ms. Red, please rise. The jury, having carefully considered all the evidence and the arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense, has returned a verdict of not guilty. The jury found that the prosecution did not meet its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As such, this court is bound by the jury's verdict. Accordingly, Ms. Red, you are hereby acquitted of all charges in this matter. You are free to leave this courtroom, and no further obligations remain before this court regarding these charges. This proceeding is now concluded.
Initiating Google search for Karen Read trial. Answer yes or